I'm going to start this project comparing Green's work and Thomas Armstrong's work, and throwing a little bit about my concerns around assessment inside of these. I think Thomas Armstrong makes a good case, but sometimes in making a good case, you still don't have a great argument. Green, in her work on the next page, spends a lot of time talking about allowing diverse voices to come to the classroom. And Green's case is probably the one I grew up with, so therefore it's the one that maybe I have a little more appreciation, whereas Thomas Armstrong would be newer to me. But I think the failure in his argument is to assume that strengths are all we need and that we can gloss over the significant differences that we have causes me concern. It causes me concern in the sense that parents discuss the diagnosis of their children, be it with ADHD or LD, as almost coming out of a forest after being lost. It's not that you're still not in a forest, but now you have some kind of direction to seek. You know what path you're moving in. And Green might talk about it as in the sense that you're able to find and own your own voice. And I think Thomas Armstrong misses that, because all the things he says are completely and perfectly fine, except that he misses one key piece. And that is that there's a certain lens of our identity that no matter what we put in place, doesn't allow for who we are to be identified without understanding the nature of our disability. And he makes some references to assistive technology, and I make some notes inside of here that simply argue that that's not the case, that students with disabilities, even after they find assessment tools that match their learning styles, don't disappear. He makes the argument it's the equivalent of playing baseball and identifying that you have weaknesses in hitting, so you're going to spend more time fielding the ball, but you still have to get up at bat. And I think what people don't realize is that individuals within the disabled community, either be it neurotypical or physical disabilities, always have those options. And I made a little note in here. I said, it's like giving us stairs without a ramp. This philosophical treatise doesn't provide the teeth and the support that people with disabilities are going to need in order to survive. That being said, most of the article that Armstrong writes, I totally agree with. And I think when you actually go and look at some of the videos that, from the Khan Academy, that you're going to see later on, I think a lot of people actually follow those practices. And that's to that practice of understanding neurotypical. And I also got a kick out of him saying we're not going to add terms, and yet he adds piles and piles of new lingo to student services in hopes that general educators will pick that up and make it their own. And I'm going to follow up that idea a little bit more on the next page. Green being an oldie and a goodie, but she speaks to me. And I think there are passages in here like this one right here. Inclusion and wondering how it can occur without the kind of normalization that wipes out differences, forcing them to be repressed to become matters of shame rather than matters of pride. And I don't think Thomas means for us to do that, but by focusing only on our strengths, it is kind of a repression, because he's saying our differences on our weaknesses don't matter. And Green is saying, in her postmodernist way, you need to find your voice, you need to find your lens, you have to be able to identify who it is you are and how it is that you're going to work within the world. And that's not by incorporating the status quo that exists. It means stepping out and identifying who and what you are. And if you look at some of the research around the disabled community, Lavoie around LD, talking about getting people to understand that, and spots here where I noticed that today we talk about empathy, and there's a line in here that Dewey talks about bringing about democracy, and that kind of idea of this democracy having to change. You see that it's creating the empathy. It's allowing other people to understand where persons with disabilities are and what their needs are, and then doing what Forrest says, recognizing that there isn't a difference, recognizing that there are ways to change how we do things without whitewashing away the need to recognize our diversity, our color, our religion, our race, our disability, our sex. Those things need to be included. So, how assessment affects me is my declaration to you, being a person with a learning disability, being a person who had received many psychological batteries, and having assessments that never evaluated my spelling but didn't evaluate my understanding. It became very clear to me at a very early age that there was a major hole in assessment. And so when you listen to stuff by Marian Dukic, sorry, I'm not grading smarter, not harder, assessment strategies that motivate kids and help them learn, you get it, right? You look at those things, you look at those strategies, and you say, I'm trying to find out what people know. I'm not trying to find out what they don't know. I'm trying to demonstrate their learning. And so that is a strong argument for those kinds of things. And when you look at Sal from Khan Academy in his presentation, again, he's not saying anything that isn't new or surprising, that hasn't been said in assessment since I graduated in 1995, where there was ethical assessment, which said variety, opportunity to provide different kinds of questions, opportunity to provide different ways of knowing. These were considered assessment rights back then. And it's not that we ever lost our way. I think what's happened is that it's hard to remove ourselves from that traditional model, finding a new way to learn, because the people who perpetuate it, and Green would say this, are the people who were successful in that model, men and women who feel like this worked out and I was graded successfully, and now my job is to sit here and grade the next group successfully. And I get that. I get that we have to sit there and think about how we are going to evaluate students and what skills and abilities that we're going to give students for when they leave our institutions. And it is a reflection back on us when people leave and they're unable to read or unable to write. What does it say about us as educators and us as a public education system? But I also think that what we see happening in these kinds of processes are that it's also, the assessment pieces are also a reflection on us about why we continue to bring about models that didn't work for the vast majority of people. That sometimes that's the taken for granted, that assessment hasn't worked for the vast majority of us, that in a system that's not supposed to grade us as being good or bad or indifferent, we have a system that sits there and says there's an A product, there's a B product, there's a C product, the same way that it was done 80 years ago. And even though the tools have changed, the embarrassment and the shaming that has gone on in education, either intentionally in some cases, but for the most part unintentionally, stigmatizes the students. And even when we provide them with the tools that would allow them to succeed, they choose to ignore them, or they're never given enough time to develop them because it takes time to switch from one modality to another. The one piece that I thought Thomas really missed out on in a big way is that voice to text doesn't happen automatically. People who can draw and express themselves in comic strips have to be taught how to do those things. They're not natural to the student until the student has developed that ability, and then they become natural. They look easy, but they're not. And so it's a set of skills. It's kind of a way of changing. And I think I've really found like Khan and Grading Smarter, Not Harder really hammered in on those kinds of ideas. So assessment is one of those things that we are going to look at in a serious way, but many of us will just continue to repeat the patterns that we have done so before because that's been the only way we know how to do it, unless someone walks us through universal design for learning, differentiated instruction, assessment for learning. They're just all words. And I think part of it will come back down to this piece here. And I liked what he said in the video. He said, when I learned what my outcomes were, then I had less problem differentiating from them because I knew what I was differentiating from. I wasn't teaching